Hi, everyone, and welcome back from lunch. Hope you had a nice break and some good food. This is our next session. We have an additional one after this, so we're glad that you're able to join us for the rest of the day. Um, I'm Eudora Struble. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Technology Accessibility at Wake Forest University. The session is going to be recorded and will be shared after the conference. We also have professional captioning and American Sign Language interpretation during today's session. You can access those settings in your Zoom menus. And please use the Q&A to ask any questions. We will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. And you will have the option to post anonymously if you do prefer that. If you have any issues with Zoom, please email tap@wfu.edu. That's tap@wfu.edu, and someone who is monitoring that email will get back to you as soon as possible. And please remember to complete the survey at the end of the session. We'll share that link in the chat at the end of the session. So today we are so fortunate to have Davita DesRoches with us today to talk about accessible communications in evolving media landscapes. Davita uses she, her pronouns. She is the alternative media specialist for the Center for Learning Access and Student Success at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem. And that's North Carolina, for those of you who are not a part of North Carolina. Davita's been working with students at Wake Forest to support their access to the academic environment by providing assistive technology and course materials in alternative formats since she joined the team in 2019. Wow, that feels so long ago, as a graduate student employee, and we're very fortunate to have her as a full-time employee at Wake now. She believes that accessibility work is at its best when done collaboratively and wants to thank her students and her colleagues at Wake Forest and in the North Carolina Collaborative for their immeasurable impact on her professional practice. So Davita is going to mix it up a little in her presentation, so I'll let her explain when that's going to happen. But remember to use the Q&A for any questions that you want to have answered at the end of our session. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Eudora, and welcome back after lunch, everyone. Like Eudora mentioned, I'm going to mix it up a little bit. My hope is that we won't hit the post-lunch slump, but since we are on Zoom, if you fall asleep during my presentation, no harm, no foul. I believe that kind of ease of personal rights during a presentation is also about accessibility. So thank you for being here with me. I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. Okay, it looks like my screen is not sharing. Give me 1 second. Sorry. Okay, give me 1 second, everyone. I think my window is not opening for some reason. Let's try this again. Okay, there we go. So welcome to our session this afternoon on accessibility and communications and marketing. This session is entitled Share the Journey, because that is the point of communications and marketing, is to make sure that we're sharing the story of the work that we do, the events that we plan, and then any other information that folks might want to interact with who are interacting with our work, especially in the higher education space. So as already introduced, my name is Davita. I have the privilege of working with the wonderful folks at Wake Forest. My role is primarily student-facing. That's kind of the foundation of my work, student and faculty-facing, and work really around the academic space, around the classroom, course materials, all of those important things. But the reason that, as I was thinking through this presentation today, one of the things that stuck out to me is, given the way that communication and media kind of works for us, most of us are communicators, whether or not that is officially a part of our training or our job title or, kind of job duties. And so although obviously for some folks, this is kind of their priority number one on a daily basis, I would say for those of us who write emails, who publish things on websites, who create videos and other instructional materials. We are all communicating in our own way. And so my hope is today that we can kind of take a baseline approach so that there's something that you get out of this, both for your own professional and personal practice around communication. So my objectives today are to step back a little bit from some of the details of accessibility. We'll get into some of those details, but let's think a little bit together about how effective communication happens, because in my kind of experience, spoiler alert, thinking about accessibility has helped refine my communication practices to make them more effective. And so I kind of want to make the case to you today, where you can kind of start with there. And then we're going to learn about some high impact accessibility interventions in the communication space and specifically how that's going to show up in some common platforms that we use. And then my hope that your takeaway from this session is that you will have a starting place for your own kind of accessible communications practice. So, as alluded to, I have a short kind of opening activity for us to participate in together. Again, we're right after lunch, so I want to make sure that we're all kind of thinking and active, do something a little bit creative, a little fun. So I am asking my friends behind the scenes to open up the chat so that we can all participate together in this activity. So with the permission of our wonderful admins today, hopefully we'll be able to kind of all participate in this activity together. So the idea behind this activity is that when we create content for social media platforms specifically, both examples in this activity are from Instagram, we have multiple ways of communicating meaning. So we have images, we have videos, we have captions, and typically all of those pieces go together to communicate the meaning. And so sometimes one without the other doesn't communicate the full meaning. And so what I'm going to do for the first one is I'm going to show you a picture and I'm going to give you a brief image description. And then using the chat, I would like you to tell me what you think this Instagram post is about. Okay, so that's the instructions. My hope is, can I get a thumbs up from someone behind the scenes that we can use the chat? Is that active, Eudora?
It is, yes.
Okay, amazing. So just make sure that when you enter a response to this activity that you're setting it set to everyone so that everyone can see your responses. Okay, so here is our first post. So in this case, we have an image of 10 adults dressed in business casual, standing on the field, the practice field of the Wake Forest football team. So as you're able, as you have some ideas, please drop them in the chat. What do you think the purpose, what do you think the caption, the purpose of this post is? I'll give you a couple minutes to enter some ideas in, and then I will share with you the original caption from this post. So please, let me know. Okay. Okay, whoever wrote cheerleading tryouts is my new favorite person. Okay, yes, staff tour, celebrating the completion of an event, 10 demons. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Staffing in the athletic department, new non-traditional Wake Forest football team. Yes, thank you. Introducing the team, graduates of the health and exercise program. Okay. Something related to the athletics, the practice field finish, opening, a group of people. Okay. Okay, yeah. So I love this. There's lots of guesses about why a group of kind of staff-coded adults might be interacting with an athletics facility. Some ideas about, the facility opening, all these different things. So I'm going to share with you the original caption. We'll see how well you did. Here's the caption. Announcing the new at Wake football starting lineup for spring 2024. Kidding. Our academic coaches focus on the classroom and leave the coaching on the field to our great colleagues in athletics. Thank you to our friends in Student Athlete Services for hosting us today for a great joint meeting and a quick tour. So, as some of you surmised, this was a tour of athletics facilities with some campus staff. The extra little piece of context you are missing, because you may not be familiar with these wonderful people, is that they are my colleagues. And so we work in the Academic Success and Disability Services office here on campus. And so we love to get a tour of any kind of new athletics facilities when we're over meeting with our counterparts in athletics. And so we love to take a little photo to make us look a little bit more official. None of us will be playing for Wake football this fall. So, unfortunately. Okay, thank you so much. It was really interesting. I think what's interesting about this example, outside of the fact that this is from our own Instagram account, so I feel comfortable using it, is that, like many of you guessed, there are various different reasons that staff on a college campus might be interacting with an athletics facility. And so the context of why those staff are interacting with that athletics facility is key to the message of this photo, which is to say that we are highlighting the fact of our kind of professional relationship with athletics, which is a really formative one to the work that we do supporting student success and student access on campus. So that caption, that photo without the caption doesn't fully translate what's going on. Okay, y'all did great. So next one is going to be just a caption, no photo. I will read the caption out for you, and then you will be free to drop your ideas for what this image might be in the chat. Okay, so the caption for post 2 reads, "Meet Adams." Dog emoji, white heart emoji. Adams is an 11-month-old bundle of joy with a heart full of love and curiosity. He has the most playful personality and is truly a bundle of sunshine. Sunshine emoji. Yes, we have some puppies. Okay, people are guessing photo of a puppy. Someone said adoptable puppy. Photo of the mascot. Great guess for a college campus. Some adoptions. Very cute pup. Yes. Image of a puppy smiling or playing. Okay, interesting. A dog that belongs to a staff member visiting the office. I like that. We're creating a story. A therapy dog. Okay. Puppy adoption day. Baby with a dog next to it. Okay, we're extrapolating. Class mascot. Yes, thank you. Shout out to our owl. Okay, got some great guesses. Very much puppy themed. Some different iterations of the puppy, some different ideas about what this puppy might be doing. So I'm going to show you this picture. So this is a picture of Adams, a sweet 11-month-old who was available for adoption. I don't know if he's still available for adoption back on April 30th through the Forsyth Humane Society, which serves Forsyth County, where Wake Forest is located. I'm a super fan of this Instagram page. And this photo is, like I said, a post by Forsyth Humane of a young puppy with what I can only describe as very large ears. So, but what's interesting about this one, I considered when pulling this caption, I considered removing that puppy emoji because I think, or the dog emoji, because I think that would have made what this, what this post meant a little bit harder to figure out from the caption. And it is interesting how people figured out, added in pieces. But I think the most important piece of this example is that knowing that this is from Forsyth Humane, that's a different context than like your friend or family member sharing their new dog on Instagram. This is a post that's really about making sure that, a rescue dog gets a home, and that's really important. And so communicating that out clearly, that this isn't just a cute puppy, but this is also a cute puppy who's in need of a forever home, is an important element of this post that you might not originally get just from that caption. Okay, excellent work, everyone. I wanted to reward you with your excellent work by showing you a picture of a puppy. So thank you so much to my facilitators. We can go ahead and close the chat for now. And yeah, just thank you for your participation and for humoring me today. So in reflecting a little bit on this activity, I think what's interesting about thinking about accessibility in this space, in the mass communication space specifically, is that there is a lot of different pieces that we use to communicate meaning when we're crafting content for these spaces. And some of that meaning too is like contextual and cultural. So in that first picture, some of the important context of that photo of knowing who those staff members were might be super evident to someone who is familiar with my office, with my staff. But if you were an outsider and you just saw that photo and you maybe saw it was attached to like our Instagram, but you weren't exactly sure who these people were, you might not fully understand. And so sometimes too, when we use these spaces, we also rely on kind of cultural context and cultural information of our campus cultures. And as we think about pushing our message out there, that's another thing to consider when we consider accessibility, is what are the kind of hidden and embedded messages that we sometimes use, either visual cues or other reminders to signal to people. And that's an important thing to consider as we consider accessibility. So, in order to guide our conversation today, I wanted to center our conversation around kind of three primary questions and some threads that emerge from those questions. So, I want to think a little bit about who our audiences might be. What do we know about them and what do we not know about them? I think that's an important place to start when we think about accessibility. And then we also, another thing that we want to think about is what is kind of essential? What's the essential message that we want to communicate? And how do we best communicate that? And how does that line up with some of our accessibility practices? And then the question that's like on everyone's mind when we think about accessibility, particularly about things that can be costly in terms of time or resources, is how do we maximize our existing resources to communicate well? And so I'm going to have some starting places, but my hope is that you take these questions and kind of ruminate on them and think through how they might apply to your own work and space. So let's talk about audience. So when we think about accessibility and access needs, our approach changes significantly when we know our audience, right? When we have a limited known audience versus a more public audience. Or even in the case of an event like today, when we are, soliciting registration from a public audience. So it might not be everyone in the world, but it is people that we might not be as familiar with, as opposed to like a staff meeting with your team, where you kind of know everyone and have a general sense of their access needs. So you can like design a meeting agenda or other meeting materials with those things in mind. I will say I still recommend normalizing procedures for accommodation requests, even with a known audience, because our access needs change over time. That is the kind of deal of being human, is that our access needs are going to change as we change. And so normalizing that procedure can help to create kind of a good flow of communication and clarity in your own known audience spaces. And then what I'm going to suggest to you today about the unknown audience, right? The big audience that none of us really knows everything about. My advice to you today is to make assumptions about that audience with a bias towards accessibility, right? So expecting access needs from your audience and starting from there as your kind of like creative process and your workflows unfold. So number one thing to consider, just assume that people are engaging with your content in multiple ways. We've talked about this in every session today. People encounter objects, content through different forms. And so we want to make sure that the message, right, the meaning can be conveyed through all the different ways that someone might interact with your content. The second one might be a little bit controversial, but I'm going to say that when you're thinking about communicating with a wide audience, I would assume a level of distraction or inattention. Now, seeing as I am doing the presentation today on social media, I thought that I should dip my toes into a little bit of internet discourse. People love to wring their hands about people paying attention to things, people's attention spans. This is this is always kind of pertinent and relevant in our kind of internet space, especially as we talk about scrolling, scrolling culture, young people, really being attached to their phones, older folks as well being really attached to our devices as well. And so we like to talk a lot about distraction, and we like to kind of wring our hands about what this kind of morally means for us as a society moving forward. My pitch to you today, at least in your professional work, is to just kind of take this as like a kind of pragmatic, realist approach to your audience, which is to say that most people that are interacting with your content do not have their full focus and full effort dedicated to your content when they're, reading it, viewing it, whatever. And so, for example, if you're writing a newsletter, right, that goes out from your office every week, and it takes about, I don't know, 8 to 10 minutes to read, and it's got like paragraphs of text. Not everyone might be able to dedicate that 8 to 10 minutes to kind of read that in depth. And so you might want to make sure that you have a summary somewhere where someone can pull out kind of the main points of that newsletter. What are the main events? What are the main kind of, developments in your office that other folks need to know about? So that's what I'm going to say is my point two, is assume some level of distraction and inattention and think about your communication in that regard. How do you get a message across immediately? How do you allow people to engage with different levels of focus and attention? And then my third point is thinking about when you think about your audience, assume that they are going to be using a variety of different kinds of technology with different levels of comfort using that technology. And this is because basically we are most comfortable with technology that we are most accustomed to using, but that is so personal, right? The kinds of devices, brands and like operating systems of devices that we use is incredibly personal. And depending on how much time we spend on those various kinds of devices, that directly impacts our comfort level. And so if someone is reviewing, is looking at your flyer on a smaller screen or a bigger screen, are they getting a similar experience, right? Are they still able to get that message across from you? So thinking about those various different kinds of technology and also the comfort levels of your users and using that technology. And so thinking through the kind of usability of your content and the usability of the platform, honestly, because some of these platforms we'll talk about, the social media platforms, they work really well on a mobile app, but they're a little bit clunky on a browser. But some of your users might still be using a browser. And so how do you make sure that they can still engage with your content on a browser in a meaningful way that gets the message across? So with that in mind, thinking about multiple ways of engagement, we've talked already today about alt text and then captions and transcripts. These are two big ways to kind of think through, particularly kind of mass media communication when it comes to our like primary kind of like social media platforms and other content hosting platforms. So when we have an image, we want to make sure that there is an image description, right? So the meaning of that image can be communicated. Um, Now, alt text is like a feature of the image. It is embedded into the image so that screen readers can read it aloud as they're interacting with the image. So typically, depending on the platform, and it can vary from platform to platform, there's a way when you're like editing and creating your content where you can include that. And so then it will be a part of that post moving forward. Um, Note in the definition, alt text is described as a short, concise description, and it's really supposed to kind of focus in on the meaning and function of that image. And so if you want to describe the image in more detail, you rely on the text that accompanies the image. So, maybe add that in the caption. If it's a website, maybe add it in the text that follows the image. So if you want to kind of add more context to the image, in addition to kind of the nuts and bolts of what it means, how it functions, use that additional text that accompanies it. This is partially because if you've ever kind of tested a screen reader, the screen reader will kind of automatically, typically if it's scrolling through content, it will read the full text that is attached in the alt text. And so for the screen reader users, if you make the alt text too long, that can kind of bog them down in the process of like reviewing things. And again, assume a level of distraction, a level of inattention, and just try to keep it short and concise. And if they want to engage with the content more in depth, maybe they will read the text attached to it as well if they didn't, if they want a little bit more. But make sure they can get the essentials through the alt text. Captions and transcripts. My colleague Brittany did a wonderful job of giving some more in-depth and technical advice about captions and transcripts in our 10 o'clock session today. In general, though, it's good practice to make sure that there is a full text version available of any audio content. So captions, as you may know, are kind of synced to your video, your audio. They're going to run along the screen as it is playing, whereas a transcript is typically kind of a static file that contains that full text version, can be time-stamped, doesn't have to be, but it's typically kind of just like a continuous scroll of text unless it is like time-stamped and so acts kind of dynamically with the audio or video. I just want to note here, because as we talk about social media, auto captions are going to come up. Auto captions are useful and they can be useful to a lot of users, but they do not meet the legal standard for effective communication. And I think that's really important as we talk about compliance and regulations to make sure that if we are making compliant social media content, we are making sure that our captions are edited by a human. And in some cases, your platform is going to give you a kind of tool that allows you to edit that caption or those captions as you go. And then if your platform doesn't support a full text transcript, either linked or like placed somewhere else nearby the post and the content, make sure that you give your user clear just directions for how to find that full transcript. It's baffling to me that this many years into Instagram, you still can't link things in an Instagram caption. So if you need to link a transcript connected to an Instagram post, make sure you give really clear directions for where that is in that caption, since you cannot directly link it. Okay, so I am going to ask my friends behind the scene to help me turn on the chat again, because I have another activity for you as we kind of think about how do we communicate effectively? How do we kind of focus in on our intended message? So with that in mind, I'm going to show you two flyers. These are both flyers that I have created, so I'm putting myself on display for critique and feedback. But I'm going to show you a couple of different flyers that I've created for a workshop series that goes on through our office every year. And so what I want you to do is I have put a image version of this on the slide, and then there also should be a tagged PDF version that's linked on the slide. And if someone behind the scenes could drop that link in the chat for me, if they could find it, that would be awesome. But basically, this is a flyer for a time management workshop back in January of 2024. The workshop is at 6 p.m. It has free pizza. Those are the basics of the kind of intended message of this. So for those of you who are able to access this visually, I'm curious to know, as you kind of take a look at this, if you're able to, yes, thank you, Eudora. If you want to use that link in the chat to check out that tagged PDF, what about this example helps communicate that intended message, and what is maybe distracting from that intended message in this flyer? So we'll take a couple. Yes. Okay. Thank you. You guys are already following my instructions. Okay. So we have some notes about how it's busy. The sparkles are distracting. I would argue that sparkles are never distracting, but to each their own. Sparkles in real life are never distracting, but you're right. In digital accessibility terms, they can be distracting. The big free pizza is helpful. Okay. Yes. The owl in the corner is pulling focus. Her name is Ollie. She's our mascot. Yes, no visual hierarchy applied to text. Okay. Text and logo. Yeah, the all caps text can be hard to read. Okay. Great. Yeah, what is the order that I should be reading this in? So, okay, so someone does like the owl, the pizza, and the blackboard because it's on theme. So I will say a couple things that I learned. First of all, I had to tag this PDF for this presentation, and that's when I realized that this was a really difficult PDF to tag. So the whole reading order, the visual hierarchy of this flyer is not super clear. So that's an important piece to remember when you're creating something that you want folks to engage with both visually, but also potentially, as a tagged PDF or, a document of some sort, is to really think through that visual hierarchy. And then, yeah, other notes about some questions about kind of spacing. Is the all caps text easy to read? But then there are some positive comments, right? About pulling focus to the free pizza, which obviously we're working with college students. We want to highlight free food whenever we can. And a couple comments here about colors. And so, yeah. I'd still show up though. Thank you. Thank you, Kayla. I appreciate your willingness to show up. Another thing I just want to know about this flyer is I made this one in Canva. And so it kind of uses the feature of Canva, which is the ability to kind of layer different visual elements over one another. But if you export that and then try to tag it, it's going to recognize all of those different images as individual images instead of a grouped image. And so that was really difficult to tag. So just being careful about kind of layering visual elements, because that is a little bit easier to do in tools like Canva. And now Wake has Adobe Express, which is kind of their response to Canva. And so just thinking about that when you're creating visual elements. Okay, so I'm going to show you the next flyer. And what I want you to do, Eudora, if you could drop that second link in the chat so that folks can engage with it. So this one is my kind of iterated design for this new year. So I'm curious what stands out to you in comparison to the other one. What's better? What might still need some work? What's kind of going on here? Okay, so we have comments on, yes, the size of the text. Looks like a certificate is funny. Okay, yes, Adam, I'm so sorry there was no pizza this time. Okay, visually less busy. Yeah, seems like a more serious event. The font sizes lead you through the document better. Okay, yeah. Okay. Okay, more readable, less inviting. Very interesting. Okay. Um, what a certificate for eating pizza. Okay, see, this is why it's fun to open up a chat in a Zoom webinar. Um, I will say one of my favorite things about this space of communications and social media, is that it's a great space if you are a person with a sense of humor. And especially working with college students, I think a sense of humor is vital. And so I appreciate you all bringing your sense of humor today. So yeah, definitely some good comments in here. Some interesting things about text size. I will say when you think about text size, an important thing to consider. So this is a flyer that's designed for digital screens around campus, because it's kind of designed in the same dimensions as like a presentation slide. And so it is designed for larger screens than probably you're viewing it on now. And so that's something to consider when you consider font size. But if I was going to design this for Instagram, I might want to look more carefully at those font sizes. So that's certainly like, again, the size of the display is something to keep in mind. Um, this one definitely has a kind of more unified visual themed, as people noticed. It's a little bit less busy and therefore, as some people noted, a little bit less fun. Um, and so, yeah, so there's definitely some pieces here that are kind of a corrective from last time. Also, this is a little bit more in line with kind of our general branding as an office, which is part of my intention. We had a separate logo for our OWLS workshop, and so I kind of wanted to bring it back in line with kind of our Wake Forest black and gold standard, but also with our office's logo, which you can see at the bottom of this flyer. But as some of you noted, there are pros and cons to this kind of more sleek version of design because, as people noted, this feels a little bit less fun. Also, there's no free pizza, and I can't remember if we serve pizza at this event. I can't remember. But you're right, that kind of loses some of the fun. And I think finding ways to make the fun parts of your design, the fun parts of your communication still accessible is an important part of doing this work, especially in the space of higher education. So thank you all so much for your comments. I appreciate it so much and your participation, and for pointing out things that honestly, like I hadn't even kind of thought about and noticed as I was putting together this activity for our conversation today. And I think that's the important thing too about this process is the feedback that you can receive from colleagues, from your students, from users, particularly if you have colleagues or students that you work with that have access needs, talking to them about how they interact with content, what stands out to them, what doesn't stand out to them, that can be a really important process of thinking through this. Okay, so when we think about design, we already talked about this a little bit. When choosing fonts in general for kind of designing for like social media, especially flyers, these kinds of things, choosing more standard and non-stylized fonts. Someone made a good comment, I think, in the first about the first flyer with the all caps that might be confusing. And I think that's a really good point. So just being clear in how you use your fonts and not kind of getting too complex with your kind of creative instincts. When you're entering text into a platform like Instagram, like Facebook, make sure that you use the kind of standard text entry and don't try to copy in kind of special figures or special like fonts from outside. Oftentimes a screen reader will just skip right over that, and so you'll lose whole parts of your caption. Emojis. Emojis are a kind of controversial thing, in part because emojis are so interesting to me because they have their own kind of cultural life and context that is really based on a kind of visual language that we're forming together as a society. However, a computer does not understand emoji language as, humans understand emoji languages. And therefore, like these objects all have kind of titles or names. And so a screen reader, as they're going through a post that has emojis attached to it, is going to read out loud whatever the title of that object is. And it might diverge from the intended meaning. And so this Emojipedia, which is linked here, and you'll have access to if you have access to the slides, can kind of guide you, walk you through what are the kind of embedded meanings in these objects that screen readers are going to use. Also, if you repeat emojis, your screen reader is going to just read that object name back to back, and that's going to get incredibly tedious. So just be conscious and thoughtful about repeating emojis in your captions. And then we were talking about color a little bit as we were talking about the flyers, but paying attention to contrast is really important. I've also linked my favorite contrast checker at the end of these slides in the resources section through WebAIM. And then also another thing that's important is to not rely in our messaging as we're talking about things, as we're showing people things, to not rely on color as the sole source of meaning. We talk about this a lot when we talk about like assessments and color coding something on an assessment that students have to like identify. That's not going to work for folks who have some kind of color blindness. And so just not relying on color for meaning is kind of a good general accessibility practice. Okay, and that brings us to our final conversation. How do we maximize our existing resources to create accessible communications? And so this is another place where I'm kind of inviting you to take a step back. Because as we talk about accessibility, sometimes it can kind of feel like a lot of additional work or additional steps that you have to take. And my colleagues today have given you really practical tools for how to kind of build some of this into your process. And so it's important to remember as we think about kind of regulations and compliance, but also just creating more accessible communities that we all work and live in, accessibility should never be considered an optional step. And so we're not kind of we're not doing accessibility when the budget allows, when our time allows, but we're kind of building it into our practice. So my first piece of advice here, when we think about creating content and communicating, consider that less may be more. When we think about the kind of media landscape that we all live in, it's incredibly saturated with content. And so just creating content for the sake of content is not communicating effectively. And so how do we think about what kinds of content, what like approach to content, what's going to kind of break through that noise and stand out for us, or what is kind of something that's going to easily work within the workflow and skills of our office so that we're not kind of having to, retrain ourselves or kind of learn a new skill in order to communicate and create content. So how do you work from kind of your existing skills and then also be selective about the kinds of content you create, how often you create it, and kind of be strategic about that? Because then that will allow you to maximize your resources to make sure that when you are creating content, you're creating it accessibly. My other piece of advice is that there are really basic kind of file types that you can work with to create similar resources to maybe the more complicated kind of multimedia ones that might actually fit the task a little bit better. The example that I'll offer you today is also from my work with our office. We had a bunch of instruction videos that we'd created for our new student data management system. Back when we released it in 2020, we didn't have a lot of face-to-face student contact, and so a video was a great replacement for that. However, those videos quickly became out of date. If anyone has kind of created those instructional videos, they can kind of become obsolete pretty quickly. And so we just kind of kept hitting our head against the wall about updating this video, and no one really had the time or the expertise to kind of set aside to work on it. And so I proposed something that I'd already been using for another task of mine, which is basically just a Google Doc with instructions. It has step-by-step text instructions and then screenshots so that students can follow along both text-wise and visually to kind of learn how to do something. And I've linked an example of how to create a new student application in our system. But this has kind of proliferated. There's so many of these Google Docs that now live within our system that we share with students to help guide them through these different processes they have to follow. And it's just become a great resource because it's something we can update really quickly and it doesn't require kind of the labor and time that might be assigned for like creating a video and then captioning it and all of those things, making sure that it's, correctly audio described, all of those things. So with that in mind, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the major platforms and kind of the pros and cons and what each of them have to kind of do with accessibility before we end today. So I've kind of stuck to mainly alt text and caption upload. If you want to read more in depth about the accessibility of these tools, you can certainly go on their websites to kind of see what their individual commitments are. Facebook supports alt text entry. It will also generate automatic alt text. Automatic alt text can be great for a laugh, is rarely helpful. I do know that some of our generative AI tools are getting better at describing images, but describing images is a little bit more complicated of like a machine learning kind of problem. And so typically I would say write your own alt text as a kind of default, and maybe work with AI tools when you're working with something a little bit more complicated. Facebook supports caption upload as a subtitle file. So that means you really can't edit those captions kind of in the tool, unlike other tools like Instagram and TikTok, which give you a little bit more dynamic editing power. So you just have to make sure your subtitle file is accurate before you upload it to Facebook. Instagram, like I said, supports alt text entry for images. You can enable auto captions on your own Instagram account. And then you can also edit auto captions in stories and reels. And so Instagram will give you its own captions. I do want to note TikTok is after Instagram, but they did innovate this caption editor, I believe. And I think Instagram actually adopted it in kind of competition with TikTok. But TikTok for me was kind of the initial caption editor tool. The one thing I will say about Instagram, its stories are deeply inaccessible and accessible for screen readers. They really have not figured out how to make the text in stories or even like the links in stories super accessible to screen readers. I was just messing around with voiceover on my phone on Instagram before over lunch today, and it's still pretty rough. So hopefully they will fix that. But I would say if you have something essential you're communicating on Instagram, don't communicate it through your story. Make sure that it's on a kind of grid post if it's something important for your users. TikTok has its caption editor. TikTok kind of innovated the audio tracks created through text-to-speech software. You have probably heard some of these voices over like internet videos. It's kind of a fun tool that people have really had a creative time with it, but it's both fun and accessible, which is kind of the intersection of my interests. So I love that. And then TikTok on Global Accessibility Awareness Day this year dropped some new accessibility features, including alt text entry for their image posts. And I've linked the kind of full press release in those resources if you want to read. Twitter, I'm just going to run through these, also supports alt text entry for images and then caption upload again as a subtitle file, so not something you can edit. And then YouTube supports auto captions on some videos. YouTube's a little bit inconsistent in how it applies its accessibility features, but I will say if you are creating on YouTube, it does have tools to help you upload or manually edit your captions. And so do make sure if you are a YouTube like content creator that you're doing that. And then if you're using other people's YouTube content, make sure that they're doing their due diligence with captions before you like share it. And then there's limited access by creator for audio description tracks. This seems, again, a little bit inconsistent, a little bit uneven. So a cool possibility, but not really fully being used to its potential. And then just a quick reminder here that when we were talking about regulations earlier today for the ADA in Section 504, social media posts are included in these updated digital accessibility guidelines and regulations. Pre-existing social media posts are one of the exceptions kind of before that date of compliance hits next year. But I will say in general, if you have any content on your social media page that's like pinned, right, or highlighted somehow, even if it is past content, If someone made an accommodation request for that content, you would have to honor that. And so my recommendation would be to make sure that anything, even if it's past social media content, anything that's considered to be up to date or that you're directing people to for information in the present, make sure that that is kind of up to date and compliant and just kind of update that as you need to. So those are kind of my last, I think, pieces of information about social media. Yes, this is my resource page. And so if anyone has any questions, I think I have time to take a few.
Thank you so much. That was a lot. Thank you. I think people probably learned a lot and will be scouring your slide deck for more information. Okay, so we do have a few questions. Do you have any recommendations for how to incorporate audio description in social media videos?
That is, sorry, I got on the wrong slide. That's a great question. I will say, I think audio description is a kind of challenging space for a lot of people to kind of think through from a technical approach. And so I would say if you're new to even like the concept of audio descriptions and not quite sure how to like insert an audio description track, it doesn't feel like a lot of our social media tools are really like going there in terms of supporting that on like a content creation level. So I would say start with the good kind of best practices that I think Judy and Brittany talked about this morning about just being more conscious about describing what you're talking about, right? Identifying speakers as they enter into the video. I think starting there and therefore cutting down on the need for additional audio descriptions is going to be the most powerful thing, especially in the social media space where you're typically not creating super long videos, right? They tend to be quite short. And so just making sure that the kind of audio script is engaging with the visual aspects of it.
Thank you. Any advice for balancing design and creative design with accessibility? Rachel has said that she's heard lots of complaints about accessible templates or guidelines interfering with design and creativity. And I know I have a lot of conversations with people who are raised on graphic design about how to make accessibility a part of that. Do you have any tips?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this as I was working on this presentation because I think I probably identify as part of like the Microsoft Paint and like PowerPoint word art generation, which is maybe not the greatest graphic design we've ever seen, but certainly is some of the most like funky and creative. And that might have shaped some of our sensibilities and our kind of in that era of our lives. And so I do think that question often emerges. And I think that is a question that I kind of, I think partnering with those who are, I'm not a graphic designer by trade. I kind of dabble in this world. I'm more of an accessibility person. And so if you have a graphic designer and an accessibility professional at your school who are willing to kind of enter into this conversation together and figure out how to make it work for your context, for your school, your brand, your colors. School colors are a big thing when we think about designing accessibly in this space. I think this is a place where like the meeting of the minds is really important because I think we want to honor the natural creativity of this space, but we also need the technical expertise in thinking through how do we communicate things accessibly and clearly. And I don't think we have to abandon one for the other, but I think we need to like work together to figure that piece out.
I 100% agree with that. And I think we can't abandon one for the other because then we miss part of our audience. So, okay, one more question. This is a tricky one. You have any guidance on writing alt text when there might be students of different identities in a photo, when you may not know how they identify themselves? Do you have any thoughts or resources you want to share about that?
That's a really great question. And it's a question that I think this space has stumbled over, like the technology space has stumbled over a lot, especially I went to a great session that I think Apple did at a conference on their machine learning algorithm for like describing images. And basically what Apple decided to do was to go down to like kind of the bare minimum of image description in terms of things around gender, race, age, things that kind of run into kind of sensitive protected classes. And I don't know that that is the full solution as we think through image description. I will say in general, the same thing goes for when you like create and publish content. If you're publishing content about students that you work with, making sure you have their permission, maybe having a conversation with them about how they might want to be described in an image. If it comes to that, if maybe a short, concise description that's a little bit more objective for the alt text, but then maybe a longer image description that you develop in partnership with like the students that you work with other folks in your office who might have other ideas. Because yeah, we don't want to lose the kind of diversity of identity as it is represented in our communications. But we also don't want to make assumptions, particularly if we're working with content that is not something that may be like a photo that we took or a video that we worked on, that might be more like, you know, kind of the stock database of images of like students on our campus that many of us have access to. So yeah, I would say good conversation, open partnership around those things. Because the technology tends to default to kind of the lowest common denominator and kind of focus on the more objective parts of that image.
Thank you, Davita. And thank you so much for this presentation. So many good tips and loved the activities. Really appreciate you being with us today. And we will start our next session in about 9 minutes. If you all want to go ahead and take a break, we'll see you back then.